ASVAB World Knowledge 2023. What does outskirts most nearly mean? Outlying areas. What does humiliated most nearly mean? Embarrassed. What does precise most nearly mean? Exact. What does unblemished most nearly mean? Flawless. What does prolific most nearly mean? Profuse. What does enmity most nearly mean? Acrimony. What does minute most nearly mean? Slight. What does boisterous most nearly mean? Clamorous. What does impart most nearly mean? Transmit. What does infested most nearly means? Overrun. What does empirical most nearly mean? Observational. What does deference most nearly mean? Respect. What does substantial most nearly mean? Sizable. What does appealing most nearly mean? Attractive. What does partial most nearly mean? Incomplete. What does abrogate most nearly mean? Repeal. What does aggression most nearly mean? Attack. What does costly most nearly mean? Expensive. What does defiance most nearly mean? Rebelliousness. What does scarce most nearly mean? Rare. What does cleansed most nearly mean? Washed. What does silence most nearly mean? Quiet. What does modified most nearly mean? Changed. What does inquire most nearly mean? Asked. What does wandered most nearly mean? Roamed. What does compendious most nearly mean? Laconic. What does endured most nearly mean? Survived. What does claims most nearly mean? Allegations. What does appealing most nearly mean? Attractive. What does boast most nearly mean? Brag. What does concepts most nearly mean? Ideas. What does properties most nearly mean? Characteristics. What does promising most nearly mean? Hopeful. What does coast most nearly mean? Shore. What does rebuke most nearly mean? Reprimand. What does culpable most nearly mean? Blameworthy. What does obstinate most nearly mean? Stubborn. What does livelihood most nearly mean? Career. What does realistic most nearly mean? Accurate. What does afflicted most nearly mean? Cause pain. What does undertake most nearly mean? To take a task upon yourself. What does clandestine most nearly mean? Covert. What does instigate most nearly mean? Initiate. What does gaunt most nearly mean? Extremely thin. What does erode most nearly mean? Wear away. What does oath most nearly mean? Promise. What does condone most nearly mean? Excuse. What does candor most nearly mean? Honesty. What does costly most nearly mean? Expensive. What does trepidation most nearly mean? Caution. What does disparate most nearly mean? Different. What does maintains most nearly mean? Keeps. What does toiled most nearly mean? Worked. What does incident most nearly mean? Occurrence. What does gregarious most nearly mean? Sociable. What does abate most nearly mean? Lessen. What does obtain most nearly mean? Acquire. What does aggression most nearly mean? Attack. What does claims most nearly mean? Allegations. What does bolted most nearly mean? Branded. What does rescind most nearly mean? Revoke. What does indefatigable most nearly mean? Tireless. What does amicable most nearly mean? Friendly. What does parity most nearly mean? Equality. What does venerate most nearly mean? Revere. What does tangible most nearly mean? Real. What does precocious most nearly mean? Advanced. What does mundane most nearly mean? Ordinary. What does placid most nearly mean? Calm. What does chronic most nearly mean? Habitual. What does juvenile most nearly mean? Youthful. What does vociferous most nearly mean? Vehement. What does cursory most nearly mean? Superficial. What does wry most nearly mean? Droll. What does poignant most nearly mean? Affecting. What does battled most nearly mean? Fought. What does spoiled most nearly mean? Ruined. What does absolutely most nearly mean? Completely. What does festivities most nearly mean? Celebrations. What does comprehend most nearly mean? Understand. What does vindictive most nearly mean? Vengeful. What does vex most nearly mean? Irritated. What does brevity most nearly mean? Briefness. What does opulent most nearly mean? Luxurious. What does irate most nearly mean? Furious. What does succinct most nearly mean? Concise. What does placate most nearly mean? Satisfied. What does derelict most nearly mean? Abandoned. What does pensive most nearly mean? Thoughtful. What does vibrant most nearly mean? Vivid. What does onerous most nearly mean? Difficult. What does exhaustive most nearly mean? Thorough. What does nominal most nearly mean? Small. What does maintains most nearly mean? Keeps. What does obtain most nearly mean? Acquire. What does trepidation most nearly mean? Caution. What does vibrant most nearly mean? Vivid. What does clarify most nearly mean? Explain. What does contrive most nearly mean? Fake. What does dwell most nearly mean? Linger. What does humble most nearly mean? Meek. What does indicates most nearly mean? Shows. What does coast most nearly mean? Shore. What does financial most nearly mean? Relating to money. What does exert most nearly mean? Make use of. What does concepts most nearly mean? Ideas. What does ephemeral most nearly mean? Fleeting. What does perpetual most nearly mean? Constant. What does camaraderie most nearly mean? Companionship. What does clarify most nearly mean? Explain. What does promising most nearly mean? Hopeful. What does evident most nearly mean? Clear. What does scarce most nearly mean? Rare. What does irate most nearly mean? Furious. What does apathetic most nearly mean? Emotionless. What does credible most nearly mean? Reliable. What does abruptly most nearly mean? Suddenly. What does intrepid most nearly mean? Brave. What does fetid most nearly mean? Putrid. What does legitimate most nearly mean? Lawful. What does verbose most nearly mean? Long-winded. What does alleged most nearly mean? Unproven. What does cede most nearly mean? Surrender. What does afflict most nearly mean? Agonize. What does conspicuous most nearly mean? Bold.